So if you were with I don't know much about German spirituality. We visited Germany for the first time last year, and we were blown away by how beautiful the country was and how lovely the people were. Genuinely blown away. But I don't know much about the spirituality. So does the German tradition, for want of a better word, have deities? I know the Welsh does, obviously. Do you work with just the Welsh, or do you work with whoever comes your way? From a deity point of view.
For me, it's the opportunity to blend both of my cultures that makes witchcraft so special. There's not this idea of it's one of the things I struggled with in Christianity was this concept of baptism and tying yourself to one thing so intensely, whereas that level of commitment isn't a thing in my practice, at least quite the same. And so being able to blend both of those cultural influences into a practice that makes me feel whole is a big part of it. So I do very much draw on both. In terms of the German side of things, there are a few issues that make it difficult, predominantly the witch trials. So much of folk belief got caught up in that. So I can talk about that from one perspective, because obviously I'm currently working on I'm currently working on Pagan Portal's Frau Holler. And as part of that, I'm researching her as a goddess. And she's probably the preeminent goddess in German tradition, at least today. But looking through history for centuries, for at least a millennium, she's been such a feature of folk religion and folk belief. So there's no real doctrine, there's no real shrines, but there is a genuine and incredibly potent undercurrent of belief in her across many traditions. And what we see is that these figures get caught up in the ideas of the witch trials and turned into something darker and sort of given this Christian veneer of evil. And so unpicking it makes trial records very difficult to use as folkloric sources, because you have to kind of unpick where that dialogue happens between the Inquisition and the genuine beliefs of the people, and what's projected onto it, what comes up from below, and where does that all meet. And it's an incredibly difficult task, but we know for a fact that Frau Holler does get caught up in that, because there's one trial record, only one, that mentions her directly, and it's an individual who undertakes a spirit flight. We have several records of individuals who quite freely confess to undertaking spirit flights. They don't see any harm in it. They believe it's something that brings benefit to their community. Every time they undertake these spirit flights, the crops grow, they're given the knowledge of healing from goddesses, fairies, spirits, whatever. And so they see this as a good thing. It helps their community, and so they freely confess that. But that gets distorted into the idea of a malefic witch's Sabbath. And the same happens with the account of Dielpoyer. So he freely confesses that he flies out to Frau Holler 4 times a year, and that when he does so, the crops grow, the community is blessed. She reveals to him the knowledge of who's going to die in the year. She sits presiding over a cauldron when he describes her, and in the flames under the cauldron are the spirits of the damned, and all manner of things are going on. But he doesn't necessarily see this as a bad thing or something he has to hide. He confesses that. The problem is then the projection from above comes onto that, and it's twisted into a witch's Sabbath where it's not Frau Holle, it's actually the devil, and he's put to death on accusations of witchcraft. That's the only time we actually see her come into the trial record. But the interesting thing about that is we have similar accounts of spirit flights, and obviously these records, they're made not by the individuals giving their beliefs. They're recorded by what are essentially Christian people, and there are likely to be omissions made. Obviously, we can't categorically state that, but
it's very likely
a reasonable assumption.
Yeah.
When people have these folk beliefs, they don't write them down very often. So we're reliant on the folklorists that come along later to record these beliefs, which is kind of just a snapshot in time then. But when we're relying on the testimony of sort of trial records as the first time these beliefs might have been written down, that doesn't really point to what people actually believed or what they carried with them. So we see Frau Holler in records from the 11th century. We see her popping up. But in the majority of cases, it's Christian denouncements against her. So there's this undercurrent of folk belief that people hold closely and dearly enough that it's a threat to the established power, so much so that they denounce her. But we don't actually know, well, who is this figure they're denouncing? What does she do for the people? Why does she matter? Because they just know her. They don't need to write her down. She's just part of their lives. So it's a challenge sort of disentangling what actually was believed versus what was recorded. And also there's this tendency sort of within academia more broadly to see the written word as the be all and end all. If it's not written down, it's not real, it doesn't exist. If it is written down, it is real and it's gospel. But in these instances, you quickly see how much that falls apart. Just because something's written doesn't mean it necessarily reflects a true belief, whatever truth might be. But just because something isn't written doesn't mean the belief didn't exist either. And obviously we can't evidence that, we can't prove it, but neither can we disprove it. So it's a challenge of digging between those lines and figuring out. And the realistic answer is we will never know truly what people believed. But what we do know for certainty is they held Frau Holle very dearly. She mattered to them enough that they carried her for documented. We can prove documented at least a millennium. And that's an incredibly long amount of time for someone to survive within essentially an oral tradition. She's carried on the stories about her, on the fact she matters, on the offerings that are made, so much so there are denouncements made against her. But knowing that she mattered, we can make her matter to us. And I think that's the important thing, and that's where the connection comes. Not in necessarily venerating her exactly as she always has been, because we don't know necessarily how she always has been.
No.
But
And times change too, don't they? Like how we live changes as well.
Exactly. So Frau Holler certainly is a part of my practice and matters a great deal. And then one thing that we do have going for us is that in Germany, that's where the whole concept of folklore kind of originated. So everyone who had a spare pen and paper went out and started collecting folklore in Germany in the 19th century, even the 18th century in some cases. So I often joke with Brett because he does a lot of research and a lot of writing, and he's digging for these sources and desperately trying to find these scraps of information. And I bring out 6 tomes of folklore and go, don't know how to sort through this. So we have the opposite problems. But then again, you have sort of the idea that folklore is a static moment in time. And also, it's wonderful that we have so much to draw on when it comes to the German, but not much has been presented either. So it's kind of hidden. So it's been nice to be able to sort through that a little and start to draw some of it out. But then also you see all of those contradictions start to come about. And do you know what? It makes perfect sense to me because we look at that and we think, oh, what was German witchcraft? What was German magic? What was German folk magic? And you get a load of different answers and contradictions. But then you think, what's witchcraft today? And if we did a survey right now in this moment and went, what is witchcraft? What is folk magic? What are people doing? I guarantee we'd have just as many contradictions.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yes, they always say, ask 12 witches the same question and you'll get 13 different answers. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Try researching English history. We have nothing. We didn't write anything down. It's rubbish. You think of all of the fairy tales that come from German background as well. It is a rich tapestry. Unfortunately, the witch seems to be the baddie in all of those, doesn't she? But it's beautiful tapestry of folk tales to draw upon.